Hi, so welcome to the leadership hustings for the LGBTIQA plus Greens. It's 6 o'clock, so we should get started. Just some quick housekeeping for this. If you are not speaking, it would be a good idea to keep your microphone on mute. Obviously, our candidates probably are in a quiet room, so they probably could just get away with not having it. If you want to speak and ask a question, feel free to say your name, your preferred pronouns, as well as your local or regional Green Party. Feel free to also pop them in the chat. Me and Chris will be happy to pick them up and ask them to the candidates. What else? Not sure if there's anything else. Oh yeah, of course, this is a safe space. In our safe spaces guidance, so take a look at our code of conduct and our dog whistle guidance, which is published on our website. Um, and yeah, so this is going to be going on until I believe it was 7:30. So yeah. Um, so starting off, we're just going to do our sort of opening statements from our candidates. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So Ellie, would you like to start?
Hi, thanks, Melissa. Hi, everybody. Really lovely to be with you here tonight. Thanks for organising this. And yes, I'm standing with Adrian Ramsay to be co-leader of the Green Party. It's a hugely exciting time for our party. You know, we've had this really successful period. We've quadrupled our number of MPs, doubled our number of councillors, and we're really excited and ambitious about the next stage for our party. And we can see that there's such a huge need for a strong Green Party. So many people feel so let down by Labour. People who had a degree of hope last summer are telling us that they've lost it because we see a Labour government that's behaving in a way that's completely counter to the hopes of so many people, whether we talk about the complicity in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the continuation of the cruel two-child benefit cap, the cruel attempts to cut benefit for people on PIP and UC health element, any number of other areas of policy have betrayed the hopes of so many people. And at the same time, the Conservative Party justifiably lost the faith of the electorate after 14 years of appalling policy making. So there's this huge opportunity for the Green Party to step into that space. And it's so important that in doing so, we're able to appeal to the broadest possible range of voters. And those are lessons that Adrian and I have learned through years of experience of winning elections, both at local level and at national level. For the Green Party to win in our fundamentally unjust first past the post system, we need to be able to speak about the passions that underpin Green policies, our bold ideas in language and in a tone that is able to win support from people of all political backgrounds, people who didn't perhaps previously consider that they might be able to vote Green, but we've shown that we're able to do that. We know how to win elections. We know how to speak in a way that people can listen, and we've shown that by overturning huge majorities to win Green seats. And what we know is that when people vote Green, they keep on voting Green. Any of you here who are councillors will know that it's through that dedication to public service at local level that we win over Green voters and we keep people voting Green. So we've got this huge opportunity and we've got a real choice ahead of us. Do we communicate to a narrow base, people who are likely to agree with us automatically already, or do we continue the strategy that's been so helpful for us in recent years of reaching out to people, speaking about our concerns, countering the rise of the far right in the way that we know changes people's minds? I've personally experienced it on the doorstep by speaking truth to power, by telling our own stories in ways that are compelling, and by convincing people that the Greens are a credible, trustable political force and powerful political force. That's how we've been winning elections so far. That's been such a successful strategy for us. And that's why Adrian and I want to lead this party into the future, because at the next general election, we want to have the maximum possible number of Green MPs so that we can shape the direction of future government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie and Zack.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've done lots of these hustings now, and as Green Party members, I imagine that this isn't your first one. But if it is your first one, quick recap. I've been talking a lot about bold leadership, and I'll go into that in a moment. But it really struck me just as I was turning the laptop on now, what bold leadership means. And actually, I can't think of anywhere more than an LGBTIQA hustings to talk about bold leadership, the bold leadership of Martha P. Johnson, the bold leadership of Harvey Milk, of Audre Lorde. Like, we stand on the shoulders, of giants, of LGBTIQA heroes, heroines, and non-binary and queer people who have stood and shown bold leadership. They did not change the world. They did not transform our country by incremental or steady change. They weren't there to fit in. They were there to stand out. They were there to hold clear to our values. And let's be very clear. Right now, the far are writing the script. They're writing the script on trans rights. They're writing the script on queer and gay lives. They're writing the scripts on women's bodies. And actually, it is time for us to change that script. And we don't do it by focusing just on Westminster. We don't do it by being in the corridors of power, where we know there has been so much corporate control. And for so long, LGBTIQA voices have been marginalized. We know this happens on the streets. Now, this isn't just about throwing bricks, although there's certainly time for protest action as well. This comes from winning MPs. But we don't win MPs by being polite. We don't win MPs by vacuous statements about being very broad and speaking to every single person in this country. We do it by being clear to our values, by being bold about our values, by growing a grassroots movement that no is not polarizing 50-50. It's about the 99% versus the 1%. The 1%, those multimillionaires and billionaires, the corporations who are destroying our environment, destroying our democracy, and destroying our communities. It's really, really important to join that up too, that it is that same 1% who seeks to divide our communities. It is those same fossil fuel companies in America, particularly 45 of them that are linked with the gender critical movement, that are seeking to try and create division in our country. Now, we don't avoid that division by ceding ground to it or by saying people have legitimate concerns. We make sure that there's not division by being really clear about our values, by standing by human rights, by making sure that the marginalized voices and the vulnerable voices always have the safe environment in which they can speak. Because it doesn't matter if you're LGBT, if you're disabled, if you're a migrant, if you make sure that the space is safe or the environment is safe for the most vulnerable and marginalized person, that lifts up the space for everyone. So in terms of my leadership in the party, I want to see bolder leadership. I want us to be really clear always about what we stand for, and crucially what we always will stand against. And when I say leadership, this isn't about one person or me running around the country or being on TV. It is about using the platform that I have been doing in the last few years to amplify other voices, to tell the stories of other voices, to make sure that every single person's voice is included. If you talk to one LGBT person, one gay person, one bisexual person, one asexual person, they cannot speak for the entire community. They can only speak for themselves. So, and although there will be shared values, it's important that those voices are heard so they can tell their own individual stories. And finally, it's about now. We cannot wait until the leadership election. We cannot wait until the next general election. We need to step up now, because we know more than ever before there is no single party other than ours that is in a place ready to speak for LGBT people and with LGBT people. And if I win this election, I will be the first out gay person ever to lead a national party in British politics. That's not a reason to vote for me. I think there's a whole host of other reasons, but I think it is a significant moment. Let's make sure we have many more of those significant moments in future politics where we see more and more people from our community elected.
Cool, thanks, Zach. What we'll do for the questions, we've got 4 that we sort of pre-selected from the membership. What we'll do is we'll just try and alternate between Ellie and Zach goes first, just so then it's a bit more fair. So first question, we are seeing restrictions on trans people and some cis people's access to health public spaces, creative jobs, social exercise opportunities, i.e., sport. This clearly affects well-being and compromises trans people to out themselves and is othering. We also experience silence by supposed allies or caveated support to include transphobes. Why do you include or avoid including trans people when talking about health, well-being, education, jobs, and topics such as suicide? And this is from Miles Rowe, they, them, and Mid Suffolk Green Party. Zack, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Can I just check how long you want for each answer, just so I can work out how to, because there's a lot there.
A couple minutes, like maybe 2-3 minutes.
Okay, great. Where to start? I think I should start where I started with my opening statement, to be clear that none of this is accidental. All of the conversation about toilets, when you kind of really drill down to where it goes, if people start to make distinctions between biological sex and social sex or gender, all it ever really ends up becoming is that they're asking for people to have a third space for toilets. And that's clearly not acceptable. As a gay man, it really reminds me of when there was gay marriage, we were told you can sit over there, but you can't quite sit over there. We need to be really compassionate about all of these approaches and recognize that these haven't been a problem for decades and for generations. And the culture war that has been whipped up for a very deliberate reason, which is to exclude trans people, to exclude trans bodies and their voices from society. Where I want to get to, but I can't in 2-3 minutes, is not just putting out the fire and dealing with the problems, but actually talking about what does trans joy look like? What does it look like when we can celebrate the contributions of trans people? But I'm not going to get there in 2 minutes, so I'll go back to the problems. I think around healthcare, we often talk about broken arm syndrome, where in healthcare, a trans person goes to see a general practitioner and they don't see a person as they would normally see a person in terms of a whole ecosystem. They just see a trans person. And it's really, really important that we have more training and education for practitioners and more education in space more generally to make sure that trans people are included in that very space. When it comes to jobs for trans people, I think it's recognizing that the contribution and the experiences that trans people have had can be, the transferable skills can be incredibly large. The amount of resilience it takes to be a trans person, to live, to experience the experiences you've had, and the kind of transformation that takes. There's loads of jobs, and far too often in the workplace, there are so many disadvantages to someone's voice not sounding quite right, or whatever reason someone might be misgendered. And the very final thing I want to say, really, I had permission to share this story, is from a cis woman who works for the Green Party. She was locking up her bike a few weeks ago at one of the constituency offices, and she experienced abuse from a group of young boys. She said they were probably about 15. The abuse was transphobic. She's not even trans, not that that would make it okay. But her point in telling me and wanting to share this story is that transphobia in society doesn't just affect trans people, as awful as that is. It affects all women, and all women who might not look like cis women, because gender is used, or sex is used in that phrase as well, to put people into a box and narrow what definitions are. And gender, even if you go back decades, I've just been rereading Judith Butler. She talks very often about how gender was often used to make sure that women knew their place, that it was either in the kitchen or there were certain jobs for women. And I think we're seeing a recycle of that now, but just in different words and different codes. And so I think it's really important as a party, we're always speaking about trans people, not just in terms of their most basic rights, but absolutely across everything, including transport as well. You can almost pick any issue, and the climate crisis, of course. And these issues already exacerbate inequality. And of course, we know if someone's LGBT, and particularly trans, that further exacerbates the inequality. So we have to be really specific to know that there's a problem before we even get to the solutions.
Thank you, Zack. And over to Ellie.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to whoever submitted the question. The first thing that I suppose I want to say is that trans people's voices have to be front and centre in decisions about trans people. So I think the second part of the question was about how making sure that, you know, whether we're working on or speaking about health policy or education policy or anything else, trans people's voices have to be front and centre in the conversation. trans people's rights are human rights. You know, I believe in universal human rights. I believe everybody has the same right to be treated with dignity and respect, to have access to the same level of services and so forth. And yes, I'm really distressed by the level of transphobia and hatred that there is in society. And I've met with, you know, a number of my constituents who come to see me. Specifically, I was meeting with trans constituents before the Supreme Court ruling and the EHRC guidance, but a number came to see me afterwards and were saying things like, honestly, this is ridiculous. I've used women's toilets for years. Nobody's ever had an issue with it. What, this ruling is meaning that I can't? And Zack talked about, what was it, trans broken arm syndrome or whatever. And, you know, we also hear about, I'm not quite sure what the right phrase is, but, you know, trans bladder syndrome. If you're trans and you're kind of not sure if you're going to get abuse for going into a particular toilet. Personally, I think people should be able to use the toilets that align with their gender identity, you know, end of. Likewise, recreational sport. Again, a trans woman in my constituency came to see me and said, you know, I've been part of this local sports association for ages. Everyone, when I first joined, I checked with the other women, are they happy for me to play? They're completely happy with it. But what does this ruling mean that is called into question? And so there's, you know, really big areas of kind of confusion and lack of clarity, and really problematic. And the EHRC interim guidance was, you know, horrendously rushed and problematic. So I wait with bated breath to see what comes out of the more recent process of developing guidance. I think that there are some really small areas where biological sex, birth sex, may need to be taken into account. So, for example, in some areas of competitive sport, I think it's reasonable for the governing bodies for those sports to take that into account. I've spoken with cis women who've been subjected to abuse, who've spoken about their need to feel that they have access to services for dealing with abuse that are specifically for cis women. And there must be ways for us as a society to be able to provide fully inclusive services, not that everybody has to be together, but that there are services available to everybody that meets their needs. That surely is what treating everyone's human rights equally must mean. And so I think there's a need for us all to listen with compassion to others. I can see some people are putting emojis of thumbs down and shocked, presumably relating to me talking about some cis women who've been abused, feeling that they need to have access to counselling services with other cis women. And I'm saddened, to be honest, if that isn't something that can be approached with sensitivity. I think it's possible to approach with sensitivity everybody's needs.
Thank you, Ellie. I will pass over to my co-host for the second question, which I'm just popping in chat. So if you would like to read that out, Chris, and do question 2.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Melissa. And good evening, everyone. And apologies that I was a little bit late. I said I had some technical issues very shortly before the beginning of the meeting. So thanks for your indulgence on that front. It's kind of fits on to where you finished, actually, Ellie, and I'm going to come to you first. As we said, we'd rotate, where they go. So in a Reddit AMA, Ask Me Anything, I think, is the reference. Ellie stated that she believes that the rights of trans people and cis people can come into conflict in areas such as prisons. Are there any circumstances the candidates would advocate to put a trans woman convicted of a crime in a men's prison? Are there any circumstances that candidates would advocate to put a cis woman in a men's prison? If there is a discrepancy between those two answers, it would be good if you could explain. So starting that with Ellie.
Thank you. Yeah, and these are really, really sensitive issues, and my view is that they should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And my expectation would be that in the vast majority of cases, trans women should be housed in women's prisons. But I think we have seen real life cases where that has been an issue. And so I think these do need to be dealt with on an individual case-by-case basis, on the basis of ensuring that everybody's rights are protected. Clearly, if a trans woman was being imprisoned, her rights are as important as the rights of other prisoners too. Everybody's rights are of equal importance. In prison, it's a very complex environment. There are many vulnerable people in prison, and I think on a case-by-case basis, that's the best way to deal with the most complex cases. But I also want to say that, my overarching message is, it's really wrong to kind of, and this is what is sometimes done by people in the far right and people who are whipping up hatred, somehow implicitly suggesting that all trans people are somehow suspicious, or that is absolutely, totally wrong, totally something that I utterly disavow. There are all sorts of people of all sorts of type in the world. My starting assumption with anybody is that they are a person of good heart and good intention. And all of the trans people I have known and loved, none of them are prisoners. This is not an issue that comes up. I simply mean that in some areas where there is potential complexity, particularly around vulnerable women, there needs to be a case-by-case approach. But for me, the default should be a trans woman should be housed in a trans women's prison.
Thanks, Ellie. And Zack, same question.
Yeah, so the party believes in the principle of self-ID, and I don't see why in any context that would change. I do agree that issues are bespoke, as what you would with any prisoner, but that's really got nothing to do with gender. It's to do entirely with the safety of the individual prisoner and also the prisoners around them. I reiterate actually what Ellie just said in terms of, well, I'd take it wider and say whatever a threat.
Oh, I think
we might have lost Zack there for a moment. I think we should probably.
You're back, Zack.
Are you back?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Apologies.
Go ahead.
I don't know where I got up to, but that it shouldn't be based on their gender. It should be based on the individual prisoner. But it's important, as Ellie just said, essentially that trans women are not a threat to cis women. The threat very often is cis men, and we should be really clear about that and not talk about trans as a threat.
Thanks. Back to Melissa.
Right. Yeah. I feel maybe it might be handy for just Zack's sort of bandwidth if people who aren't speaking just turn off their cameras. That might be a little bit handy. Just to help out. Obviously, the candidates can keep theirs on, so just yeah. Question 3, which hopefully comes into the chat, is do you agree with gender critical people when they say the Supreme Court's judgment provided clarity, or with trans people when they tell you that it has created confusion and is significantly threatening our rights? And this is from Andrea Granger, she, her, from Horsham Green Party. Zack, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. I also just wanted to acknowledge in the chat, I saw someone say that misgendered Judith Butler and that they go by they, them, sometimes go by she, her. Thanks. I didn't know that. Do I agree? I mean, it's caused nothing but confusion. And to see Keir Starmer say that this is the Supreme Court's judgment, so that's my view, is a complete misunderstanding of the role of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is there to interpret the law. MPs' jobs and political parties' jobs is to campaign for changes in the law. So yes, the HRC guidance was an absolute mess, but even before then, the Supreme Court judgment demonstrated that the law, as it currently stands, needs to change and make sure that there's greater protection for trans people.
Cool. And Ellie?
Thanks. Well, the purpose of the Supreme Court ruling was in theory to clarify, but it has caused huge amounts of additional confusion. So arguably, we need new law in order to address those areas of additional confusion. Yeah. Cool.
Nice little answers to the questions. I will pass over to Chris for question 4, which I will pop in the chat right now.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so question 4: how will you win over trans people and their allies who are reluctant to vote Green because of incidents of transphobia by some members of the party? And that is from Chad Gowler, they them, from Sheffield Green Party. So starting with Ellie.
Thanks. I'm interpreting this question as meaning, how do we win over trans people to become voters for the Green Party? Is that it, or members?
Yes.
Voters.
Yeah, voters.
Yeah. I suppose this is a question I would start by asking trans people in my campaign team, trans people who I know have voted for me locally, what their perspectives are on this issue. It's actually not an issue that's been raised with me by anybody in my constituency. But it's, that would be my starting point from the principle of asking people their opinion. And I think Zack said in one of his earlier answers, just that really important point about, when people may share a characteristic, it doesn't mean they all speak for each other. I'm a woman, I don't speak for all women. I'm a person from Herefordshire, I don't speak for everybody in Herefordshire. So I think it is important to ask lots of people their views. And like I say, this isn't a concern that has been expressed to me previously, but I want to listen.
Thanks. And
yeah, it's a really timely question, because I think it's going to become increasingly important with the Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana party. I'm sure many of you have seen the online discourse that shows that whatever this new party is, don't seem to be standing up for trans people. Now, cynically, that's good for the Green Party, I suppose, in terms of it gives us an opportunity to show our liberation, but I don't really feel that strongly for a minute. Or not strongly, but I don't want that for a minute. I just feel like the more voices we have in the political discourse who are speaking up for trans people, the better, whether they're from other parties or not. So I'm keen that this doesn't become a dividing line between us, particularly because we know that Jeremy and Zara have been trans allies, and I imagine are trans allies. I think they're just finding it difficult with some of the people they're working with. I'm not inside those conversations, so I don't know that, but I think it's increasingly sounding like that. I really, really hope that, although that isn't our responsibility, they can work it out, because actually I don't think we want to be the sole party speaking up for trans people. I think the idea is to get as many parties as possible speaking up for trans people. It really bothers me. It's a slight tangent, but I'm off on it now. That Pride said that politicians couldn't walk in Pride, because I can completely understand why that's relevant for the Labour Party, Tories and Reform. But it does feel unfair to the Green Party. That was my initial reaction. I have self-reflected and said, could we have been doing more? And this is where I guess I'm getting to in this answer. Yes, we could be doing more. We've had spokespeople in the past who have been very gender critical, and they were, one, allowed to be appointed spokespeople, and two, were allowed to continue being gender critical. Now, the argument people will make is that you are allowed to be gender critical by law, and that's true. But the court was also really clear that as a party, we're allowed to have our opinions. And the party has litigated over and over again on the conference floor, and indeed in internal elections, that we are a pro-trans inclusive party. And so this kind of desire in the past to have people who don't align with that in the sake of being a broad church, I think has been a failure of strategy and has badly let down trans people, and also made the environment unsafe often, where people feel like their contribution is not welcomed and not wanted. On the flip side of that, of course, you can have compassionate conversations with people who are not yet trans inclusive or don't understand all the issues, is probably a more generous way of putting it. And people, both women, men, and non-binary people, will sometimes have questions that are just a case of not being educated on the subject or needing time to kind of work things through. And I think there is space in the party. I would like to think so, to be able to do those things. However, there are boundaries. And if people misgender people, anyone can do that accidentally. I just did it with Judith Butler. You apologize and you move on. But if someone is doing it repeatedly, then that is harassment, and harassment should never be allowed in the party. And I think all of us have seen examples in conference floor or in liberation groups or in policy working groups where there has been repeated misgendering and there has been repeated harassment. And I don't know if it's because of the culture of wanting to keep everyone together and wanting to keep compassionate conversations has meant we haven't called that out. But you cannot be compassionate if you don't have your boundaries, if you don't say this is or isn't acceptable behavior. Of course, there's space in the middle where things can be uncomfortable and we can all have uncomfortable conversations. That's fine. But uncomfortable conversations are different to the fundamental principle of people being welcomed and safe in the identity that they choose or the identity they are. And I think far too often the party has let people down in the past with that. And I think that's partly come, so I'll wrap up now because it's a long answer, but it's a complex question, from a vacuum in leadership, where the leadership have not been clear enough about the principles and values of the party. That doesn't mean people aren't welcome to other principles and values. It doesn't mean people can't be in the party and have other principles and values. It does mean the spokespeople, the communications we have, and the direction the party is going is very clearly a pro-trans party, a pro-LGBT party. And that is so core to our values and to our philosophical basis. That's not a new thing. It's been rooted in the party from the very beginning. So let's be really clear about our core values, and long may we live them.
Thanks, Zack.
Yeah, cool. So I think we're actually at the end of our sort of pre-prepared list of questions, which means that we can now open it up to the room. Do people want to so if you just pop your hand up, then you can come and speak. Otherwise, alternatively, you can pop it in the chat when I call you, and then we can get those answered. I think Poppy put her hand up first, so would you like to?
Yeah, hi. Poppy Lewisham, Green Party. I was just wondering, you've obviously spoken a bit about your positions, but the Green Party's current position is to support gender self-identifications. But now that gender recognition certificates have much less legal weight in law, I'm wondering what your actual policy proposal would be in terms of addressing the Supreme Court judgment and the effects, particularly regarding protecting trans people's rights to single-sex spaces and things like that, in terms of, would you support amending the Equality Act or the Gender Recognition Act, or what would your actual preferred legal or policy position be?
Cool. We're going to start off with Zack with that one.
Thanks. I'm going to caveat, which was presupposed in your question, Poppy, that this is ultimately up to our members to decide the policy. And I go further than that. I hope it's up to LGBTIQA Greens to lead in terms of co-design about what the I was going to say perfect answer or ideal answer looks like. You've asked me the question though, so I'll give my opinion. I think it looks like both, actually. I think we need to make sure that the Gender Recognition Act doesn't have the loopholes that it does, or loopholes that are able to be abused by bad faith actors, and ultimately protects trans people in the way that I'd like to think it was originally proposed to do, but obviously was designed and created in a time where the far right wasn't so intent on destroying trans people's lives. On the Equality Act, I'm more hesitant. I think if this is what trans people more widely wanted and LGBTIQA Greens wanted, I could definitely get on board with that. I could see why that would be a process that would be good. The reason why I worry about it is just that the Equality Act is such a foundational document that I feel as soon as we start to change the Equality Act, that would give some of the campaigns who are seeking to remove trans people's rights kind of grist to their mill in terms of how they might change the Equality Act to make things more difficult for trans people in the future. I think to sum up in terms of the answer, I think before we change things, we have to win the fundamental argument, which is that trans rights are human rights and trans men are men, trans women are women, and non-binary identities exist. I think without having won that argument, in terms of we seem to be rolling back on that, I really worry about opening up this Pandora's box about where that's going to lead. It's not an acceptable answer for me to say we're just going to leave it alone because it's too complicated, because it's clearly going in the wrong direction. But also I'm cautious about running straight into let's change this or let's change that until we know we've got a parliamentary majority, or even let's roll back before we know we've got a Green Party majority to get the right policy passed on the floor. But I'm pretty sure that I know that our membership is progressive, and so we'll get behind whatever the most progressive and practical course of action is, but then winning power across the country to make sure that that actually gets through Parliament and we don't regress further backwards.
Cool, thank you, Zack. And Ellie.
Thank you. I mean, I'll be really honest in my answer to this. I don't know what new legislation might be required. And I think I am also waiting for the new EHRC guidance, because the interpretation of the law really, really matters in terms of its applicability in policy. So, you know, we need law that protects everybody's human rights. That's the fundamental principle. And you're right, Poppy, I can't see your hand any longer, but you're right. The Supreme Court's judgment does kind of change the heft or something of the GRA, the implications for the implications of getting a gender recognition certificate. And I suppose I would return to what's been central to many of my answers, and in fact the point that Zack was making there of ensuring that the voices of those most effective are at the forefront of articulating what changes may be needed.
Cool, thanks, Ellie. I actually think, this is an important follow-up question asked by in chat by Kid. What do the candidates think of the EHRC as it stands right now? Zack?
I think it's really compromised, not just on the issues of trans rights, but on lots of issues. There's been lots of questions about Baroness Faulkner, I want to say, the chair, questions about its approach to things, the lack of trans people in the conversation. Definitely echo Ellie's last point about co-design, but that seems to be a complete opposite of how decisions have been made. There don't seem to have been many or any trans people in the conversation, and where there has, they've been very much cherry-picked to say the things that wanted to be said. You can't have this conversation as well without linking that to the Cass report as well, where the BBC kind of on the day that the Hilary Cass's report came out kind of kept talking about it as a gold standard report and put lots of articles out, but it didn't take long in terms of peer review, in terms of it not being peer reviewed, to find how little consultation and notification there had been with trans people who actually need their healthcare systems, and also people from the community more widely. I'm cautious when I give this answer because Nigel Farage and Reform, it's kind of their MO, isn't it, to destroy democratic institutions and destroy the kind of legitimacy of institutions. And I definitely, not that I think I could hopefully do this if I tried, but come off as Donald Trump kind of rallying against the institution and saying, we've got to bring down the institution. But I also think institutions aren't neutral actors in a political space that's full of inequality, where trans people's lives have been demonized and marginalized. And so it shouldn't be a surprise when status quo power and wealth has deliberately attacked LGBT lives throughout history, that then when bodies supposedly neutral say, okay, well, this is the way to protect people, then they're not reflecting that trans rights are human rights. And it all comes back, I think, to a deep social conservatism of, when someone think of the children, or what about women's rights? Of course, women's rights matter, but we know that the issues that affect women are violence against women and girls, the gender pay gap, lack of gynecology appointments. There's a whole list of issues that affect women. But we know one of those issues that doesn't really affect women in that way is danger from trans women. That's manufactured. And so for the HRC to be coming from that place in the very beginning feels like it's fundamentally compromised.
Thank you, Zack. And Ellie.
Thanks. Yes. I do think it's really important to have an organisation that upholds human rights, but clearly, and it's important to have a kind of vibrant democratic debate, questioning our institutions and the way they operate as well. As I've said before, I think that the rush of the interim guidance, the sort of boldness of it, was really, really problematic. I have to confess, I'm really not an expert on the EHRC, and I sort of prefer not to pass judgment on entire institutions without, taking the time to really make sure that I'm properly informed about exactly what they are. And as an MP covering half a dozen portfolios, not the equalities portfolio, I don't know exactly how the EHRC has been operating in other arenas, because it covers all sorts of equalities and human rights. So I don't feel able to kind of make an informed judgment about it as a whole. But as I've said previously, it's rapid and simplistic interim guidance was really problematic.
Well, thanks, Ellie. I will pass to Chris for the next question.
Hi, thanks. So, Abigail M, you've got your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
I did. I wanted to talk about social constructs. Orange is a social construct. There's no line on the spectrum which makes between orange and red, and different cultures interpret that differently. The same way, calling me a man is a social construct. Women with androgen insensitivity syndrome have testicles and a Y chromosome, but it's a social construct to call them men, to call them women. In the same way, I have trans joy when I express female, and gender dysphoria when I had to present male. So talking about my biological sex is a false way of pretending to be scientific and objective in calling me male, when calling me male is a choice I find deeply oppressive. So as Ellie has used the term biological sex, I want to ask you to undertake to use the term sex assigned at birth rather than biological sex, because that is a more accurate way of referring to me as male. And while I'm at it, I don't want to go to a man's prison if I'm imprisoned for protest, and people are being imprisoned for protest. Over to you.
Thanks, Abigail. I'll come to Ellie first on that.
Thank you, Abigail. I really appreciate that. And I couldn't agree with you more on protest, and protest rights are under horrendous, squeeze. And the case, just to be really clear, the cases that I'm talking about, where I think that biological sex or sex assigned at birth, as you spoke about, does need to be taken into account in decisions on imprisonment, for example, are cases where somebody with male genitalia who's convicted of a sex crime but identifies as a trans woman. I think that's a complex case, an example of the sort of complex case that has to be dealt with on an individual basis. But as I said, much earlier on, in the vast majority of cases, I think trans women should go in women's prisons. And I take your point that biological sex is complex. We have at least three explanations or three ways of thinking about biology and sex: the chromosome account, the gamete, the reproductive account, and the sexual characteristics account. And absolutely, as you say, there are, significant numbers of people who have a different expression or a more complex expression. And I absolutely recognise that, and recognise anybody's right to choose to identify in the gender that they feel matches them, whether that's man or woman, or indeed non-binary. That is an individual's right to identify that way. And yes, biology is complex, but at the same time, there's a pretty stable story chromosomally and in terms of gametes that is stable across all species, basically. So I think that acknowledging the complexity is really important.
Zack.
Yeah, I do think it is complex, but I think there's other bits that are quite simple. I first just Abigail, I think it was probably your article I read today, and I just wanted to say thank you for the article, particularly talking about the importance of assigned at birth. I think that's an example where I think about this stuff a lot, but we can always learn more from listening to people's experiences. One of the reasons why I say that I don't think it's complicated, though, so for instance, intersex, for instance, there are more intersex people in this country than there are people with ginger or red hair, and we don't hear the demonization in this way. And so I think when we talk about gender critical theory, we need to treat it in the same way we treat race critical theory, which is to recognize that it's something that's been designed to marginalize people, to make things seem more complex, and to remove people's rights. And that's not a conspiracy theory. We can see that has come from Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, and we can link it right through to the right wing in terms of where these have been propagated and where this has gone. So in terms of, yes, the conversations can get complex in terms of there is always more to learn. But I think the thing for us always to bear in mind is that trans people have existed since the dawn of time. And trans people have not been demonized at the mass scale that they have since the dawn of time, although certainly they've had issues before. But the kind of mass media whipping up of it to the point where Reform and Anne Widdecombe were on TV today, slightly being to the left of where the Labour government are, bafflingly, demonstrates how manufactured the hate is. And yes, people are worried, people are scared, but we shouldn't cede ground to the right because people are worried or people are scared. We need to inform, educate, and have those conversations. But in having those conversations, never give up trans liberation, because struggle recognizes struggle, and injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And we all need to stand together in solidarity.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Zach. I think I'll pass over back to me. Matthew, you've got a question. You got your hand up.
Sorry, is that me or Matt? I just realised there's two of us with hands up.
It's you.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. Right, I'm going to put it in the chat and then read it, so I actually remember what I want to say. Yeah, so for context, I'm a non-binary teacher. I work in alternative provision. I have a large number of students who are trans non-binary because mainstream schools are not accommodating for them. The government recently published new relationships and sex education guidance that seeks to prevent schools from teaching about trans people in a return to what is very reminiscent of Section 28. We're currently waiting on new gender questioning children guidance, as they insist on calling it, that we're very worried is going to recommend what the current safeguarding guidance does, which is to forcibly out trans children to potentially abusive parents. And if it's anything like the guidance draft the Tories published, it will absolutely refuse things like calling children by the name they'd like to be called and use the pronouns they'd like to be called and things like that. So I guess the question for the candidates is, what will you do to help prevent this basically attempt to eradicate trans non-binary children? And also, and I know this is difficult for politicians, but yes or no, do you believe children could be trans or non-binary? Because there's been a massive trend towards using gender questioning rather than acknowledging that children can know their own identity.
Cool, thanks. Zach, you're first.
So the yes or no question, yes, children can be trans and non-binary. I think Section 28 is a really coherent parallel. I've talked a lot during this leadership contest, in fact, much more widely as deputy leader, the experience of being a gay man growing up under Section 28 and awful person, I shouldn't say awful person, but awful behavior of a person. Recently wrote an article about me saying that in The Spectator, talking about how they're sick of hearing politicians reference Section 28 when talking about trans identities and saying it's got absolutely nothing in common. And also, if I grew up in Section 28, how would that have affected me as an adult? The really heartbreaking thing about this is this guy was called Gareth Roberts. I thought I recognized the name, and when I did some Googling, he was a writer of Doctor Who, and Doctor Who is one of my favorite TV shows and always was growing up as a youngster. And the idea that someone can believe Daleks can fly up the stairs, or the Doctor, I was about to say they can have two hearts, but someone can't be trans, is mind-boggling in the same way that J.K. Rowling can write stories about wizards and wands, and indeed write books under a male author's name, but still not get that people should be able to self-identify as the gender they are. Sorry, I've tangented. So yes, and we're seeing this again in schools. It's the exact same power dynamic where the state decides, because of the donations and the distractions of fossil fuel companies and the people who seek to divide from the real issues in society, that they are going to take over political parties by demanding that they insist on some sort of moral panic. Moral panic happens, and schools is always where the panic is felt most pronounced, because our most kind of primal instincts, I imagine, as adults are to protect our children. And that's understandable, but it comes right back to the fact that being trans or non-binary has literally no effect on your security of the community, of the people around you. And so we absolutely have to resist this rolling back of rights, because once again, it will start with trans. It hasn't started with trans people, has it? It started with migrants as well. It started with people of color, but trans people are in that mix too, as well as LGBTIQA people. And within that mix, all of that will kind of get washed away. It also, just in a kind of parallel as well, this happens with asexual people. Like, you just hear people roll their eyes and go, it doesn't really exist, or that's not a thing. And people just constantly trying to dismantle people's identities, as opposed to go, what does it look like when people take a deep breath, when they educate, when they learn, when they make sure that teachers, GPs, anyone running a public service is educated in all different identities and all different moments. And just the final thing, I'd quote one of my best friends, who's a British Jamaican queer author, Ricky Beadle Blair. He says, he was asked once, is it not a bit complicated though if everyone's got all these different identities? Like, how am I meant to keep up? And he goes, every single door in this country pretty much has a letterbox. Is it too complicated that everyone has their own letterbox? Or could we just recognize that people are allowed to deserve their own individual identity? And if you want to talk to them, then you better knock on their door politely and put the letter through if it's solicited. And if you don't want to be polite, then clear off and go knock on someone else's door.
Thank you, Zach. And Ellie.
Thanks. So the question, do I believe that children can be trans? Yes, absolutely. Adults can be trans. People of all ages can be trans. So clearly children can be trans. And, you know, any child that, you know, experiences gender dysphoria, any child that experiences any form of discomfort or dysphoria or issue where they don't feel right in any way or need support should have that support. And I suppose the other thing is that I do feel there is a wide general societal issue about the boxes that people get put into, or the expectations around what it means to be a girl or to be a boy. And we should be working to dismantle those. So we should be working to dismantle, you know, just in the same way as, I don't know, 100 years ago, we worked to dismantle assumptions that women couldn't be doctors or engineers or MPs or anything like that. You know, we need to work to dismantle assumptions about what it means. What the limitations are of being a girl or a boy. And support every child to fulfill their full potential, essentially.
Thank you, Ellie. I will now pass over to the other Matt. If you want to ask the question, and Chris, do you want to just call out?
Sorry, Melissa, are you passing over to Chris or to me?
You ask your question.
Gotcha.
Sorry, I realized I should have passed over to Chris to ask you to, but
Not to worry. Well, sticking with non-binary Matt's asking questions then. First of all, Ellie, Zack, thank you so much for coming along and chatting to us and engaging with the LGBTIQA plus Greens. We really appreciate it. So yeah, we've spoken about putting LGBTIQA plus people front and centre of the Greens' work, and as we should, there should be nothing about us without us. But what I wanted to ask was, can you commit to working with the LGBTIQA plus Greens as people fighting for our rights within the party on how we communicate and work, not only in Westminster, but with the media too?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go on, Ellie. Sorry.
Sorry, I wasn't sure about the order. Yes, absolutely. If elected as co-leader, or indeed if not, I absolutely see it as my role to work with and support all of the groups within the Green Party.
Zack.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of I think it was last year or the year before, I went with the amazing Ria Patel, an Attitude magazine, to the Outside Project, which is an LGBT homeless charity, and just talking to people, everyone's experience, literally everyone there, all came back to mental health. Obviously, it came back to inequality and lack of material living conditions and demonization in society. But the amount of talk amongst everyone who had either lost a friend to suicide or had contemplated it themselves was so striking. Not to tangent from the question, but it's an experience I've stuck with me too as well, was one non-binary person who was in their 60s who couldn't really talk to me. They were too nervous to talk to a politician. And sorry, I get emotional talking about it. We were sat by a piano, and then I said, "Do you play piano?" And they said yes. And then they just sat, and they were just the most incredible musician. And suddenly when they were playing the piano, just so much more in flow. And then we were able to have a conversation about their identity while they were playing the piano. And then it'd be a lovely story to say they got off the piano and again they were still talking, but no, they got off the piano and just shrunk into a shell again. And that's not natural. That's what society has done to people, and that's what poor mental health does to people. Someone wrote to me the other day about suicide because I used the wrong phrase and I haven't quite got the learning. I think I said committed suicide, and that's not the right phrase to use. Took their own life, I think, is the right phrase to use. But yeah, apologies if I didn't get the right phrase.
Thanks, Zack. I think I'm going to ask another question that's been, I think it was in the chat. So let me just copy it in. It's from Tris in Bristol, who uses they them pronouns.
You want to invite them to ask the question, maybe? They've got their hand.
Yeah, do you want to ask the question, Tris? Do you want to ask it yourself?
Sure.
Yeah, cool.
So it actually goes back to something Zack said a little bit earlier. So asexual people are often overlooked in conversations about sexual orientation and rights. In comparison to other LGBTQIA identities, asexual people are actually more likely to be offered or undergo conversion therapy, have a lower level of life satisfaction, and are less likely to be out to friends. And despite asexuality not being officially considered a mental health condition, there is still a commonly held belief that it is. Additionally, within diagnostic criteria, there's a two-tier system where marginalised sexual identities who may be on the ace spectrum but not associate or identify wholly with an asexual identity, reporting distress due to absent or low sexual desires will be pathologised and given a diagnosis. So if elected, what steps would you take to ensure that the protection of this community happens? And what steps would you take to ensure that they're not omitted from future conversations?
back to Zack on that one, please.
Thank you very much. Just before I answer the question, welcome, Oliver. It's always lovely to see new members, especially the LGBTIQA Greens. Welcome. Really important question. And yes, I alluded to it earlier. I think the first thing all of us can do, and I'm not just talking about leadership candidates, but anyone, is to make sure that asexuality is in conversation more often. I think back to kind of not that long ago, but 10 years ago, amongst my group of gay friends, like asexuality was just something that we didn't take seriously because it wasn't our experience. We couldn't work out how people were asexual. I know there's programs like Heartstoppers that haven't dealt with it perfectly, but at least have started to put that into the narrative conversation. I think there's also a lot of misunderstanding around asexuality. So people often think that people who are asexual don't have or can't have romantic relationships, whereas, that is perfectly possible. This is literally about the sexual relationships between them and other people. The correlation between people who are asexual and the loneliness, though, and again, we're just back at the mental health crisis, is also very pronounced. So I think there's some generic things we can do, which are still important that we should be doing for everyone, but particularly the LGBTIQA community, which is funding our public services properly. I'm a little older than some of the people on the call, though I imagine there's people on the call older than me too. But I remember growing up in Manchester in the 80s, and I had kind of a local LGBT community, kind of community space. And it must have been 14, 15 when I was going there. Now, when I think about where I was going out at night, it was on Canal Street, and I was kind of just sneaking into bars and clubs, and absolutely loved it, and I don't regret it. But I look back and I was putting myself in unsafe conditions constantly. And with my parents, and my parents were really cool. We had a very kind of understanding relationship where I'd almost tell them anything. So if I was going out till very late or wherever I was going, I would always tell them. And I loved that we had that relationship. But the one stickler to that was I hadn't come out to them. So anytime I was going to a gay venue, I absolutely would not tell them. And so one, I had the guilt of lying to my parents because I hadn't come out, and so I'd make up stories about where I was going. I know that's a very familiar experience to many of us on the call. But two, putting myself in danger too, because I had absolutely no idea where I was. And without triggering anybody on this call, I certainly had experiences as a teenager that so many LGBT people have, where anyway, I'll let that one dangle. And yes, and asexual people I certainly put in that category, because if there is lack of education, if there's lack of security in public services, and particularly for young people, if they're never even told that what they have is valid, or recognize that that's seen in the stories they're told of the conversations they have, then it also puts them in potentially dangerous positions. And because they seek out people who might not have their best interests at heart to learn about who they are or what they care about. And ultimately, we all benefit from information and education, both in terms of our own information and education, but also the people who run public services, who are there ultimately to make sure that our human rights are protected, our safety is protected. And again, a theme of tonight, that it just shouldn't be that you're accepted as an asexual person, but that you're celebrated as an asexual person. There's been amazing asexual people throughout history, and we just very often don't hear their stories. And in the same way, whenever we hear about Black History Month, people go, when's White History Month? Or not that I'm repeating that. Or with Pride, when's Straight History Month? It's the same thing. If we had Asexual History Month, I think that would be really important. And of course, some pretty human beings with repulsive behavior would moan about it, but I think that would be helpful because it would create a conversation to be able to have about what else is being omitted from society and whose contribution is being omitted from society.
Thanks, Zack. And Ellie, same question.
Thanks, Tris. I've lost you on the screen now, but thank you for raising that. It's really important. And I think, the fact that I'm that little bit older than Zack, and when I was growing up, it was LGB was the abbreviation that we were working with, and it's expanded, and it's really important that it's expanded, that there is this inclusive recognition of the full, LGBTIQA plus. There are all sorts of variety, and everyone has the same rights. And I think, for some people who are asexual, they may want an Asexual History Month. They may want, to be really out and proud about it. And for other people, as with any form of sexuality, may feel it's their personal business, whatever. But each person should have the freedom to live in the relationships that work for them, with the same respect and acknowledgement. And so I suppose I don't think it's for it's not for me to say how asexual people should be celebrated. It's for asexual people to say how they want to be uplifted and amplified and celebrated. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, actually.
Thanks, Ellie. I'm going to pass back to Melissa for the next bit.
Cool. So we have a question from Helen. If they would like to ask the question. Sorry.
Thanks, Melissa. My name is Helen, pronouns are they, them. I'm in Islington, and I'd just like to know, what is your stance on, or indeed your plan for, getting legal recognition for non-binary people in the UK?
Ellie, would you like to answer this first?
Yeah, I think there should be legal recognition for non-binary identities. Non-binary identities are real and valid, and yeah, then it shouldn't be beyond us as a society to recognise that.
Cool, thank you, Ellie. And Zack.
Yep, also committed to say hello to Jasper, welcoming every new member in the chat. Welcome to the party, Jasper. Similar to the conversation we just had about ACEs, I think, we've just got to start putting people in boxes or limiting their boxes. So, of course, non-binary should have legal recognition. I was thinking the wider conversation too about around polyamory and the different way that people have relationships now that aren't necessarily single or married and as binary as that. And I think ultimately it's about giving as many options to people as possible, so people don't feel like they have to shove themselves into the most narrow focus, but actually can be the person they are and also have a relationship or relationships that they choose to have, and not assume that the kind of very nuclear conservative model is the model that everyone has to live by.
Cool, thank you, Zack. I will pass back over to Chris for the next question.
Hi, thanks. So I'm going to take another one from the floor. So I have Kyra, I think. Do you have a question you want to ask?
Oh, there, I've got it working. Hi there. Following on from the leadership debate on the LBC, Adrian was saying he was supporting gender criticals in the party and in leadership positions like a spokesperson, and also trying to follow in Labour's footstep opinion to both the social conservatives and the left, which is arguably losing Labour more supporters than it gains. Do you believe that you will gain more members than you will lose by inviting gender criticals into the Greens, given they have the Tories, Reform and Labour already embracing them? And also, how do you plan to protect the Green Party trans members and queer members from having to deal with transphobia, intersex phobia and misogyny and general queer phobia in green spaces, such as the now deceased Spaces Forum, the Policy Forum, the Conference Forum and other green spaces? Thanks.
Thanks, Kyra. We'll start with Zack.
Yeah, on the point of clarification, I think to be fair to Adrian, he didn't actually answer the question. So I asked him repeatedly if a gender critical person could be a spokesperson for the party, and I don't think I got an answer either way, which for me is an unacceptable answer in itself, but I just wanted to be clear that he never said yes or no to that. I'm partly not answering the question, but it's deliberately, and I'll explain why. For me, it's not, there's lots of questions that are about electoral politics and the values that you choose to have based on kind of the largest constituency and having the broadest church. And I think this has been at the root of the conversation between me and Ellie and Adrian. They've tried to pretend that I'm looking at a narrow base, but I'm actually doing the opposite. I'm talking about unifying working class communities with people who run small businesses, with people who live precarious lives, literally the 99%. So I'm looking to broaden our appeal. And I really believe that broadening your appeal involves not trying to speak to everyone and be all things to everybody. I think that's the politics that's largely been rejected. And what I'm looking to do is a politics of conviction, a politics of this is what we care about. And not only are we, the politics where people believe this over here, so we're going to go over there and say what you're saying. And I absolutely reject that politics. I think there's a politics of we're so firm in what we believe that we're not even going to shift to you. You need to come over here. I don't think that politics works. But I think there's a politics in the middle, which is where you stay very, very close to your values. You edge slowly towards where other people are, but only you kind of keep your foot very firmly rooted in your values. And you go, come over here. I'm going to win the argument. This is why. And I'm going to win the argument with bold storytelling, with communications, and with good arguments. And so I have to say, even if, letting every gender critical person in the country join the Green Party and be our spokesperson was a great electoral strategy, I don't think it is at all, by the way. I think it's the complete opposite. But I still wouldn't back that, because ultimately it's about our values. And our values are that we are a trans inclusive party. And that although gender critical people, yes, are protected by law in terms of what they're allowed to think, that's very different to the behaviour. And we certainly don't need to appoint them as spokespeople, and certainly not as future MPs of the party, because I think the people who represent our party should represent our values, and our values are trans inclusive. And I don't believe that you can be gender critical and be trans inclusive at the same time. You only need to ask a few questions before very quickly you get into misgendering or to third spaces where people aren't able to use the spaces that they identify with. And ultimately, everyone should be able to pee in peace.
Thanks, Zack. And Ellie, same question.
Thanks. Well, as I've said, I agree on peeing in peace and all of that. Gender critical views are protected in law, and so we do have to be a party in which gender critical people are welcome to participate. We can't exclude anybody on the basis of their beliefs. That would be against the law and frankly morally wrong. And it also, my understanding is that it places the party at significant financial risk to exclude people on the basis of legitimate beliefs. And I think the term gender critical is sometimes used to cover a whole range of perspectives and views. So from my perspective, if somebody holds gender critical views, that absolutely doesn't mean that they repeatedly misgender somebody or that they exhibit any form of transphobia. That isn't an automatic thing at all. And it's behavior that we must absolutely be clear about. Any form of discrimination, harassment, victimization is utterly unacceptable. But in the same way as there are actually many aspects of people's deeply held beliefs, for example, people who have deep religious convictions that might be different to values and policies of the party in some ways, that's not a reason for exclusion. So I think exclusion has to be about actions and behaviours. And we can't exclude people on the basis of lawfully protected beliefs.
Thanks, Ellie. Okay, Lyron, you've got a question. Would you like to ask that?
Yes, let me put my question into the chat so that everyone can see it. It doesn't want to. I talk too much, apparently. Okay, basically the question is, the UK is a member of the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights, as you know. And the rulings of this court are binding to the UK because we have the Human Rights Act, which includes the Charter of the Human Rights that is part of that act. And we are supposed to basically follow the rulings of that European Court. Ms. Faulkner claimed in her hearing in June that trans people do not have full human rights because apparently the right for privacy and the right for family does not apply to trans people, which means, universal rights don't apply, or we are not human, depending on how you interpret it. So the Goodwin ruling of the Supreme Court that gave us the Gender Recognition Act and the later rulings of that Strasbourg court, they basically all said that gender recognition needs to be universal. There can't be a piecemeal thing where you are a woman in one place and a man in the other place. Like, we would have that here with the Supreme Court ruling. So given the fact that the Human Rights Act apparently is just advisory and is not really something the government needs to follow, because they can always overrule it, because the Human Rights Act has exact rulings in there in Section 3, saying that the parliament cannot be limited by the Human Rights Act. How would you change that so that such stuff like this Supreme Court ruling does not happen again, and that not other human rights are violated by UK laws or UK lawmakers?
Thanks for that. So, Ellie, would you like to answer that one?
Thank you. So the point about Mrs. Faulkner claiming that human rights like a right to a private and family life do not apply to trans people, I mean, to me, that's ridiculous. The right to a private and family life should apply to every person. I'm not quite clear about where that comes from. I have read the entirety of the Supreme Court judgment, and the EHRC guidance obviously was much shorter. But this sounds like quite a detailed question of law, and I'm, not qualified to speak about lots of detail of law, but the fundamental point that every trans person has the same human rights as every non-trans person, every cis person. Every person has the same rights, and the same rights to a private life and the same rights to a family life. So, that's the principle that I would uphold.
Thanks, and Zack.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the party, we need to be clear that there's two kind of different conversations here. There's the processes we follow, and then there's us as a campaigning organisation. So the processes we follow, it is true, we have to follow the law. So if we make a process, we have to stick to it, and we have to not discriminate against anyone or, well, indeed anyone. That's not just the law, but I think that's also how we should operate as a party. Like, it's only fair that we have transparent rules and procedures. I saw someone put in the chat, and I think it is the very obvious reference here, that if someone was a climate change denier, we wouldn't want to welcome them into the party into open arms. And even if the law said we had to, we could still choose not to make them a spokesperson or to amplify their voice. I know Adrian has said that he finds it offensive when I compare being gender critical to being anti-Semitic or racist. He can find it offensive, but as a gay Jewish person, I do see the struggle as the same thing. I see people who say that I don't believe you are what you say you are, or I don't respect your protected characteristic. And being gender critical, I hear, is not the same word as transphobic. But if you're not willing to say that a trans man is a man or a trans woman is a woman, or non-binary identities are valid and exist, then I don't see the difference. And, we can find lots of conversations about that, and we can go down lots of rabbit holes. But I think ultimately it does come down to the same thing, which is a disrespect of someone's identity, or a discrimination of someone's identity based on the person that they identify as. And so the final thing I'd say on this is, when Just Stop Oil were breaking the law, we didn't say they're breaking the law, so we don't support their aims. We absolutely got out there and said we support non-violent direct action. On Palestine, we absolutely have stood resolutely, as Ellie has in Parliament. I've said this several times in Hustings and really mean it. I love seeing Ellie in Parliament challenge the Foreign Secretary and hold that bold, firm conviction with what we believe. But also, if it was up to the government, they'd soon be outlawing that speech. I'd like to think within the party we would still be campaigning for the rights of Palestinian people. And so what the law says does not have to be our party policy. Parties exist to change the law and to campaign to change the law. So yes, we absolutely need to follow the law in terms of our processes and in terms of the way we conduct our business, and we absolutely must do that. And I'm an advocate of the fact we've not always done that, and that's been an absolute shame on us, and has also been costly. So let's not do that again. But that is very different to being able to say that within the party, we don't have a right to campaign for the things that we believe in or the values that we hold dear. And also to be clear that even if you're welcome in the party because the law says so, why would you want to be in the party and be gender critical? We're a pro-trans inclusive party. We've debated that and won that on every argument, and it's very clear in every leadership election and internal election that pro-trans inclusive candidates have won. So that's not to say that gender critical people aren't welcome in the party. The question is, why would you want to be in the party unless there's been a vacuum of leadership? And I just want to make it clear, under my leadership, we will be a pro-inclusive, trans-inclusive party that do believe in trans liberation, that believe in LGBTIQA liberation. And absolutely, we will follow the law in terms of our processes, and we will have compassionate, kind conversations. But as I've said over and over again, broad churches have walls, and one of those walls is not being able to harass people.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to hand back to Melissa now.
Yeah, so this is going to be the final question before closing statements. I'm sorry, it's just how the time has come. So I'm going to go by the person with the hand up first, which is Councillor Kamal.
Hello, everyone. This is Kamal, pronouncing him, and I'm from GPEx Greens. So my question is, LGBT plus people are more likely to have contact with the mental health system and are at much higher risk of mental health issues, self-harm and suicidal ideation than heterosexual people. And they are also more likely to come up against adverse reactions from mental health staff. Therefore, my question is, are you familiar with Green Party's policies on prevention of suicide? And what will you do to ensure that we restore free sex counseling, therapy and support, accessible and available mental health counseling for the LGBT people? Thank you very much.
Cool, thanks. First up, Zach.
Thank you, Kamal, and still celebrating your election, still cheering that on. That was a wonderful win. I know I've spoken about this a little bit earlier when I talked about the LGBT centre that used to be near me when I was young. We've lost so many of those centres, pretty much all of them, and we're also losing those mental health centres. So I think the first thing is to make the argument that we need the provision and the funding, both in community services that are more broad, but also explicitly mental health services for LGBT people and indeed suicide prevention services. And the second thing is when you said most likely to come into contact with mental health services, the word I actually thought you were going to say was the police or justice. And we know that the police traditionally haven't always been friends with LGBT people. And so I think, again, there's lots to be done in terms of training around police and education, around the justice system. I know that's different to the mental health system, but it absolutely interlinks. Very often, what should be a mental health situation is treated as a criminal situation, whereas actually we need to be having much more public health approaching. And then it might sound like I'm avoiding the question because it's so broad, but it's just the absolute truth. Is everything we talk about as a Green Party is tackling austerity, tackling decades of Conservative austerity and now Labour austerity. Because if you put people into those desperate situations where they can't afford food, they can't afford rent, they don't have time to spend with loved ones because they're working every hour under the sun just to earn basic minimum wage, if they are lucky, we know then that is going to exacerbate all of these issues. And then if you're LGBT on top of that, that then just becomes what becomes often an unmanageable situation. So yes, we need specific services for LGBT people, but actually mental health in this country right now is absolutely dire. It's dire for LGBT people, it's dire for global majority and racialized communities, dire for working class people. And actually, frankly, as I'm listing this, it's dire for some very wealthy people. Like you only need to look at Elon Musk, who has a ketamine addiction. Now, I'm not shaming people with drug addictions or problematic behaviors with drugs, but that is not a happy man. And so it's a demonstration that wealth does not equal happiness. And actually, we live in such a broken society that has so lost its sense of community and purpose that all of these things are deeply affecting all of us. And people in this country are really struggling. But of course, the wealthy can pay their way out of it and can get services and mental health services. But it ultimately comes back to class and that intersection with LGBT people, that if you both are LGBT and you don't have the means to be able to protect yourself or access services, then of course austerity is incredibly damaging and it's literally killing people. And I should have put a content warning there, but that's that can be the consequence when people have nowhere to go.
Thank you, Zach. And Ellie.
Thank you. Thanks, Kamal. Again, I've lost you on the screen now, but thanks very much for raising the question of mental health, and really echo and agree with much of what Zach has said there. And just reflecting that you spoke about statistics showing that LGBT plus people are more likely to struggle with mental health, but of course there's no kind of specific reason why your sexuality or your identity has to cause you a mental health issue. You may be a bit like the broken arm syndrome, you know, an LGBT person might be seeking mental health support for issues that are completely unrelated to that aspect of their identity, but related to exactly their precarious work or home situation or disability or anything else. We have to see people holistically and recognize that all of the challenges and inequalities that people face are intersectional, and that they need to have access to services that treat them holistically and that don't discriminate against any of us on the basis of aspects of our identity. Also recognizing that if the reason that you are needing mental health support is related to your identity, your LGBT identity, then LGBTIQA plus identity, then that also you need support that relates to that specifically. And there's a fundamental problem here that we face as a society of the systematic under-focus and under-investment in mental health. You know, too much of our healthcare system as a whole operates essentially as, you know, on the ambulances at the bottom of the cliff model, sometimes literally, rather than the, you know, the guardrails at the top and the support and the community building at the top. And it's so central to so much of the work that I do in politics, in Parliament, but also in the community as a whole, campaigning for the focus on, you know, support before people get to crisis point, campaigning, working to try and build a country and a society where, you know, we all know two of the main determinants of good health, good physical and mental health, are number one, being able to be outdoors in the fresh air in a nice environment, and number two, being part of a community, having that support of friendship. And that's one of the strengths of communities like the LGBTIQA plus community, that there is so often people do find a sense of community within that. Yeah, and I've just observed an emoji being shared across the screen, and before I came to this meeting, I was asked to read the safe spaces guidance and the you know, the really detailed guidance that this group, that this community has about treating everybody with respect. And I do think that that needs to apply in all interactions to all people. Especially when somebody's trying to speak about the importance of everybody having mental health support that acknowledges their own individual needs. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ellie. And now, yeah, just our closing statements from our candidates. Do you want to start, Ellie?
I'm standing in this leadership election, this co-leadership candidacy together with Adrian, because I am hugely ambitious for the Green Party, because I do think that we are a community where there is so much more that unites us than divides us. My whole experience of politics has been about that. I joined the Green Party more than 10 years ago, after spending my entire life, my entire adult life, indeed a good chunk of my teenage life as an activist, campaigning on the streets, getting arrested, protesting against the arms trade, working in international social justice my entire life. And I got involved in politics age 40 because I just couldn't bear the direction that politics was going. I couldn't bear the rise of Farage, and I wanted more people with the values that I shared to stand up and be counted and participate in politics. But I didn't intend to, at that point at all, to stand for public office. I wanted to pay my subs, deliver a few leaflets. And it was through that, knocking on doors, speaking to people in my local community, that I found that there genuinely is so much more that unites us than divides us. I found that having those conversations with people that I wouldn't come across in my filter bubble or in my normal social circle broadened my horizons, enabled me to find ways to connect what I valued and believed in so passionately with the concerns that other people shared, even if I didn't, you know, even if I wasn't living, obviously I wasn't living their lives, incredible diversity of people. And that's the beauty of political campaigning. You know, I've had incredibly powerful experiences of speaking with somebody who told me that she didn't support welcoming refugees, and sharing my own experience of welcoming refugees, and her then coming back to speak to me half an hour later, telling me our conversation had changed her mind. That's what politics is about for me. It's what's sometimes called the Mustang Man phenomenon. Maybe you're familiar with this, but the campaign for gay marriage equality in America, and the story of the guy with the Mustang who was really attached to it, who was completely anti-gay marriage. And as part of this project, gay people went round to speak to him about why they supported gay marriage. And they made a connection. They made a connection around his grief over his much beloved dead wife. And they made a connection around how everybody deserves to be loved. And that man completely changed his views, completely changed his prejudices. And so that's the politics that I believe in, that politics of conversation and connection, that politics of really working hard to understand each other and to overcome differences. And that's the politics that I think will win the Green Party the support that we need in the country, because the Green Party is desperately needed in this country for all the reasons we've been talking about tonight, and many, many more. And Adrian and I know through our personal experience of winning multiple first past the post elections at local and at national level, that the way we do that is by reaching out, by having those conversations, by doing that hard work, and by mobilizing huge teams of people, because politics is a team game. So that's why I'm standing in this election and why I'm asking for your support.
Thank you for that, Ellie. And can I just say thank you for coming along this evening? Can't have been too easy. And yeah, I think I'll just reflect what was mentioned in the chat by Matthew about yeah, we can sort of not agree on certain things, but we don't need to, you know, attack people and stuff like that. So I do absolutely acknowledge your what you mentioned there in before your final closing statement.
Melissa, could I just take 1 second?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. I just wanted to Ellie, I just wanted to check that you'd seen that there was an apology in the chat. So I hope you did see that. So I just wanted to draw your attention to it, if not. Thanks for letting me interrupt, Melissa.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for coming. Zack.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on it, but I'm pleased to see an apology too, because Ellie's wonderful. She's turned up and she's answered everyone's questions, and agreed until I can't see who said it, but about focusing on views and not the person. That aside, one of my kind of proudest moments early on in my time in Green Party was seeing Sean Berry put out a release that talked about London, wanting London to be the most trans inclusive city in the world. And just having a moment of kind of going, well, there's someone who's elected to a senior position. She was an assembly member at the time, and I was a member, not an assembly member, senior position in the party, who's really got our backs, got the LGBT community. And there's been several moments like that where I could list where I've seen our spokespeople and leadership really put their head above the parapet, stand up for human rights, stand up for dignity, and stand up for our community when it isn't easy. It's not always a happy story, though. There have been moments in this party where I have felt shame, where I've seen the spokesperson say something that's totally indefensible, and I feel like the party more widely hasn't taken the action it's needed to take to remove the person from their role, always in the guise of compassionate conversations or giving people space to learn. So my closing statement, I guess I want to reflect on this, because I never want to be so strident that people don't have space to learn, people don't have time to ask questions. There's been a couple of things tonight where I've stumbled on a word, or I've said I've only just discovered this, like Abigail's article today, so we can get more fluent at the things we say. And I think if we're too strident, we lose people and we push people away. And I think ultimately that is not how we grow as a movement, and it's not how we grow as a community. At the same time, I believe the only way we can not be strident is if the boundaries are clear. And the boundaries are clear about having respectable, safe environments where people are not able to whip up fear or not able to shout at people or make them feel even more marginalized than they already are. And so I think as a party, we've all got a responsibility in terms of how we create those spaces. And obviously, as a deputy leader and hopefully as a future leader, I feel that extra responsibility in terms of how I model my behavior, Green Party Regional Council, Green Party Executive have responsibilities to play in terms of the elective role they have to represent all people in the party, and not just for people who voted for them and the people they agree with, but everyone in the party and more widely. And I really hope that we'll see a change in culture in the party where there are more respectful conversations, where there are more compassionate conversations. But I certainly do not blame my LGBT siblings, though those conversations have not always been respectful. When you're fighting for your right to just exist, or your right just to be heard on the most basic level, I can completely understand why people lash out, they get upset, and sometimes say things that aren't appropriate. So without playing the teacher in this conversation, I'd love everyone to kind of self-reflect and go, what can I do in this party to take responsibility for my behaviour and my actions, where I still firmly hold the things that I believe in, and also look to be able to educate and inform people. And I think that's where LGBTIQA Greens have a really special responsibility. What does it look like when we both campaign with a complete fever of the things we know to be true and to protect people's identity, but how much more effective can we be when we come from a compassionate and kind place? And I know people don't always have the spoons to do that, and that's totally understandable. If you're being marginalised or you're the person most affected, it cannot be on you in the same way it can't be on Global Majority Greens to make the party more inclusive of people of different ethnicities or global majorities. It's on allies to do that. But if you do have the space to do it and you do have the compassion to do it, I think there's nothing more powerful. And shout out to people like Ash Ruth, I've seen over and over again be attacked in terms of their identity, but not lash back in a way that I think would be understandable, but actually take a deep breath and go, let's talk about the actual facts here. Let's have an education moment. Is this a learning moment? And I'm never saying that the person who is marginalized has to do that learning or teaching, but if they can do, how much more powerful will we be as a party and how much more powerful as a country? The conversations felt quite emotional tonight, so I don't want to switch to kind of electoral campaigning mode. I think I've been clear over and over again about the things I stand for, Ellie has as well. And I think the difference is clear throughout the conversation. But I also want to end where I started, where I don't believe Ellie for a second is out to get LGBT people. And I saw someone say how much better Ellie is than pretty much anyone in the Labour Party. And I think we should recognise where the Green Party are coming from. Does that not mean that I think we have further to go, including myself? Absolutely. But I think we get there through compassionate conversations and education when we have the space and the ability to be able to do so. So thanks very much for putting on this conversation tonight. And I think the spirit that has largely been reached in terms of the quality of the questions has been a testament to the Green Party and the work that you guys do as LGBTIQA Greens.
Thank you, Zach, and thanks for coming along. Thanks again. I think with all that, we will